a trusted voice of truth and light.
God gave me a gift. I shovel well. I shovel very well.
And a rally point for those who've accepted the reality that they are not sheep.
We've got a blind date with destiny.
And it looks like she's ordered the lobster.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there and welcome to the show. You know, you really have a choice in this world. You can, kowtow, bend the knee, and submit to groupthink, or you can do as I would like you to do, and that is revel in wrongthink. It's your choice, mind you. Eric Peters from ericpetersautos.com joins me, and I think we will be reveling in some wrongthink today, right, Eric?
Oh, certainly. We won't be buying like sheep either.
Well, there's an awful lot going on. At some point, I'd like to get your take on Fauci coming down with COVID. That's definitely a topic of discussion. But something you mentioned before we went on the air, and that is we are likely very close to an announcement from the Supreme Court on a case that could overturn Roe v. Wade. What's the scuttlebutt that you're hearing?
Well, the court's about to go into recess, and apparently the decision, whatever it's going to be, has already been reached. And we know, based on that leaked memo, that it looks like it's going to be in opposition to Roe versus Wade. And all that means, of course, is that the federal so-called right to abortion will have been vacated, and it will be up to the states to determine what they're going to do. But the broader point is, if there is any diminishment whatever of Roe versus Wade, the usual suspects, meaning the woke leftists, are going to go berserk. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're already what I will call Soros pallets of bricks and cinder blocks and whatnot placed in strategic locations at cities all around the country so as to facilitate more peaceful protests to come. And that could happen any time, and people should be aware of it. I think particularly people who have the misfortune to live near any major city, because probably we are going to see some form of unrest, and it could get really ugly, I think.
No, this was the big threat. In fact, it was actually action when Trump was first elected. I know it's been a while, but people forget. I remember vividly seeing, oh, look, there are cars burning. That's not a good sign, just because the left was upset that Trump had been elected. I remember, the riots that took place through most of, June and beyond of 2020 following the death of George Floyd. But somehow, you and I are supposed to believe that the only real threat out there is people who wandered around in the U.S. Capitol, on January 6th of 2021. That was the real problem.
Of course, and where nobody was killed, except, of course, for one of the people there who was murdered by one of the cops there. But, note that we've already had an assassination attempt against a sitting Supreme Court justice, which has been, memory hold by the leftist media because they don't want people to think about that a little bit. And we've had wink, wink, nod, nod by people like Chuck Schumer and others in high authority, essentially letting the woke leftists know on the street, hey, we are actually okay with you guys peacefully protesting, that is, trashing cities, attacking people, and so on, if things don't go the way that you want them to go. That is characteristic of the left. I can't recall a time when anybody on the libertarian side of the fence, or even the conservative side of the fence, burned down a city or attacked people, women and children, and so on, just because they were upset about some political decision.
No, I think it's a very real threat. And look, I know this is going to sound conspiratorial to some, but I have to wonder if this isn't a deliberate provocation on the part of the left and those who fund them, like Soros and others in that mover and shaker crowd, trying to provoke some kind of violent reaction from the right so they can say, see, this is why we have to crack down. This is why we have to take everybody's guns.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly what this is all about. And once again, I want to reiterate a point that was made the other day by someone else, which I thought was very enlightening and very informative, which is when you want to talk about things like gun crime, which the left loves to talk about all the time, visualize the map of the United States. And you'll find that almost all of the gun crime happens in big cities like Chicago and D.C., where, guess what? Liberal woke people, Democrats, are in charge, and there's a lot of gun control. If you excise that from the map, it turns out that the rest of the United States is actually quite a peaceful and safe place to be.
Very true. And for those of us who are fortunate enough to live in rural areas, life is pretty normal. We don't see a lot of the nonsense that unfortunately is part of life in the big cities. It seems like the taller the buildings get, the crazier the behavior gets.
Sure. It's kind of like the Skinner box phenomenon, the reference there being to that experiment where you put too many rats or mice in a confined space, and then they don't have enough room to move and enough to eat, and they start to tear each other to pieces. I'm kind of a modern Jeffersonian in that I agree and think that density is a bad thing, that it undermines civilization, which ironically you think that, well, a city is the epicenter of civilization. Look, they've got all these restaurants and stores and yada, yada, yada. But cities are less civilized. There's less civility in cities. People are less polite to one another. You're more likely to be attacked, robbed, gypped, whatever it may be that's negative. Whereas in these less dense areas out in the country, people tend to be more accommodating, more amiable, and more honest and straightforward. And life is generally better out there. So, that's I think an important philosophical take-home point, demographically speaking.
Well, I just tell, I have one son who lives in a very major population center, and I just tell him, look, I don't want you to go around living your life in paranoia. You don't have to run everywhere in 3 to 5 second dashes, trying to seek cover, but you do have to be more aware. The potential for people blocking the road as part of a protest and so forth is much higher in those concentrated areas of population, and you gotta have a plan. If you find yourself caught in traffic, it's too late at that point usually to do something.
Yeah, crowds are inherently dangerous. Mob psychology takes over. Individual people who are ordinarily thoughtful and considered and civilized and decent behaving sometimes will transform into something quite the opposite of that if they're swept up by the hysteria of a mob.
Yeah, well, and I saw an example of this actually just a couple of days ago, and I think this may have actually had to do with the Juneteenth celebration in Washington, D.C. Maybe it was either there, maybe it was Philadelphia. Anyway, it was a bunch of youth jumping all over a car, and the amazing thing was the video that you could see the expression on the face of this elderly man driving the car. It was just horror. He was frozen in terror and not sure what to do. And, my heart goes out to him, but if you find yourself in that situation, it's probably because you weren't paying close enough attention to the conditions around you.
Absolutely. And that circles us back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the program, which is to be aware of developing political stories and events that could result in something that could be potentially dangerous for you. So, if you're somebody who has to work in a city or in an urban area, be aware that this decision could be made public at any moment, and it could trigger something quite ugly. And you might want to think about making contingency plans and thinking what you're going to do if you do find yourself caught up in that.
Let's take a moment here and let's talk about some practical survival advice. I know some people think it's paranoia, but man, I look at all the overlapping crises that are coming together right now, and I'm not going to fault anybody for trying to better their situation.
Sure. Right. And one of the things that we did recently, which was, I think, very apt for our situation, was to get a dog. I haven't had a dog since my lab died back in 2013. It kind of really broke my heart. It's hard for me to even think about getting another one. But my girlfriend persuaded me that it would behoove us to do that. So we recently got a lab shepherd mix. And we got him for a couple of reasons. One, because we have poultry, and we have foxes, and we have bears. And the mere presence of a dog is a countermeasure against that. It's a kind of defense policy. These predators are aware of a dog in the vicinity and will be less likely to eat your flock. But the other thing is that having a dog in the house is a great kind of burglar alarm, in the sense that he will wake you up if something is not right in the house or outside of the house, and give you that vital time to maybe grab your gun or whatever you need to do to avoid being victimized. And when you live out in a rural area like I do, there's a saying that when seconds count, cops are minutes away.
Right.
Even in normal times, even in sane times, if OJ starts coming through my window in the middle of the night and I pick up the phone to dial 911, the crime historian, that's what I call cops, will be there in about a half hour, maybe.
Well, and it doesn't help some of the stuff that's coming out, even about the Uvalde school shooting. Now we're starting to see video evidence that cops were in the school within 3 minutes of the shooter going in with rifles, with a ballistic shield, and yet inexplicably they did nothing for the better part of an hour as he was going around killing those kids. You know, it just
sure, because
boggles
it's
the
a
mind.
job for them. I'm not disparaging them as a class, but and there are certainly brave people in law enforcement. So I want to be clear about that. But at the end of the day, it's a job for them. And I think the priority for them is to avoid being killed and to come home to their families, not necessarily to sacrifice their lives for the sake of you and your family. And that's the bottom line. And it's a cold fact that we're responsible for ourselves, and we're responsible for our own families. And, you know, if things do get worse, and I expect them to get worse, I think it's going to be even less likely that we're going to be able to call upon these structural resources such as police to come to our aid.
Hold that thought. We'll be back.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Welcome back to the show. We're talking with Eric Peters from ericpetersautos.com. Eric, as we went to the break, I wanted you to be able to finish your thought about, look, you're not trying to disparage police, but if people believe, well, the police are there to protect me, they're missing out on something very important, and that is in your moment of need, they can't magically teleport to your side simply by you dialing 911.
That's correct. And as we were getting into before the break, the other thing is that in abnormal times, such as the times that we live in, it's increasingly likely that we cannot depend on these structural, institutional things that in better times were there to help us. I think that as localities start to lose the ability to pay for public services and things just start to come unglued, more and more we are going to have to accept the fact that we are ultimately responsible for ourselves, for protecting ourselves, and for protecting our families, our neighbors, and our communities, first and above all else.
Yep. And that's just part of being a responsible individual. You know, it doesn't mean you're a Rambo wannabe, although I'm sure there are those who would try to portray it as such. Let's talk about, you know, the prospect of being prepared before bad things hit. It seems to me that there's always a tendency to scapegoat the people who prepared as hoarders and conflate them with those who actually are, you know, buying up truckloads of toilet paper and then selling it back at inflated prices. Let's draw a distinction between those who prepare and those who take advantage.
Well, sure. And it's of a piece with the way saving and being responsible financially is discouraged actively in this country, while profligacy and irresponsibility is rewarded. You know, right now we're dealing with a situation, inflation, the devaluation of money, that punishes people who are prudent and save rather than spend money, whereas it encourages people to go into debt. Because why not? Your money's increasingly worth less. Might as well try and buy something with it while you still can, even if you have to go into hock. And it's a really infantile way, I think, to regard the world and also other people. You know, that ultimately we should be responsible. That's one of the defining attributes of being an adult. And part of being responsible is making provisions for things that are likely to come to pass in the future. That includes saving money. That includes storing some food, for example, and supplies for contingencies. And it's really outrageous for people who are unwilling to be responsible to disparage and attack those who are behaving responsibly.
Hear, hear. And look, I don't want to spread fear. I don't want to make people feel panicked or uneasy about life in general. But if you're paying attention, there are some very clear warning signs, particularly in regards to the food system and the food supply. Mm-hmm. And you know, the amount of exports that used to come out of Ukraine that have not been coming out of there due to the conflict there is causing huge ripples throughout the world's food markets. And, you know, the unpleasant truth that I don't think a lot of people want to face is right now, the abundance you see in your grocery store and at Costco is from last year's harvest or last year's bounty. This fall is when a lot of people are going to find out that, you know, all of these compiled disasters are beginning to add up. And if you're not taking action now while there's still, you know, time to do so, you're going to be in a much worse situation when it finally dawns on everybody that, you know, there is a major disruption.
Yeah, it's a double-pronged threat. I'm as concerned as I am about price as I am supply, because ultimately it doesn't matter if the stores are stocked if you can't afford to buy what's on the shelves, right?
Very true.
And we are getting to that point. Everybody knows it. When you go to the store and the $100 bill is the new $20 bill. It buys a bag of groceries to keep you going for a couple of days. And if you talk to people who are in the business of delivering food, and I know a number of these people, truckers and so on, they're paying $1,000, $1,500, even $2,000 now to put diesel in their tanks. And it's reaching a kind of event horizon of simple math and improbability. In other words, there's no point in being a trucker anymore because it costs too much to put fuel in your vehicle to make it up transporting whatever you put into your truck. And these guys are just going to simply shrug, to use the term that Ayn Rand did in her book Atlas Shrugged. When people just say, I'm not working anymore because there's no payoff to it. I'm not going to lose money by showing up in the morning and driving my truck and ending up at the end of the day with less money than I started out with. That's going to be devastating for the food supply because practically everything that you see in the store comes to you via a diesel-powered truck.
Yep. You have an excellent article on strategic debt that I would strongly encourage that our listeners take a look at. Tell me about what's the thought behind this article?
Well, I've been giving thought to doing something that I never do, which is to buy something partially on debt, make payments on it, and that thing being a camper trailer. It's something I've always wanted to have. But now I'm thinking it's more than just an indulgence. It might be a good way in the first place this is going to sound counterintuitive, save money by spending it. And that gets back into this whole business of our currency being devalued. If I have, let's say, $2,000 in the bank and I just let it sit there, at the end of the year, it's going to be worth 15% less. In effect, I took a 15% tax hike on that money, whereas maybe I should have used that money to buy something tangible that's of value. So there's that aspect to it. And then there's the other aspect about having literally like a bug-out bag that's actually a small home that will allow me and my girlfriend to get out of Dodge, if we have to. And being realistic, it's one thing to go backpacking for a weekend. It's another thing to be out in the woods for weeks and weeks on end with nothing more than a bedroll and whatever you can carry with you in your pack. Whereas this thing, it's a little home. You could actually live in it. Not that expensive. It has solar power, so it can work off grid. So I'm giving it serious thought.
Well, I think that's the kind of thinking that people should be looking at is what can I do to better that situation? I actually had someone ask me, one of my listeners say, well, Bryan, you don't have a lot of faith in, the banking system, for instance, and people who have their money in the bank. And, he's right. I kind of lean to people who turn their money into something that's tangible, that holds value, whether that's farmable land, whether it's tools, whether it's precious metals, whatever it may be. I think they're going to be better off because it's very clear. The Great Reset that's being foisted upon us is largely an economic and financial one as well. And it looks to me that for all intents and purposes, we are being herded into a financial prison of sorts, complete with digital currency and, social credit scores to go along with.
Yeah, it's foundationally, I think, a financial crisis. By impoverishing people, by making people dependent, you control people. Ultimately, we need a place to stay. We need food. These are the basic needs that every human being has. And if you are utterly dependent for those basic needs on some external hierarchical system, they own you and they can do whatever they want to you. The alternative being, okay, you starve and you live outside in the rain and the cold and you die pretty quickly. And as far as trusting the banks, you think? Do we have any reason to actually put any faith in these institutions which have proved themselves, like the pharmaceutical business, to be thoroughly saturated and suffused with corruption and to be profoundly untrustworthy?
Yep, that's I know that probably seems harsh, especially if somebody's got a banker in the family, but it's the systems that we're talking about. And those systems, as we saw with the Canadian truckers protest, are very much captured parts of government enforcement now and will be used and weaponized to punish people who hold unpopular or unapproved views.
Without doubt. We've experienced things that would have been inconceivable over the past 3 years in America before. And one of those things is this possibility that, they could simply freeze and or seize the bank accounts of any wrong thinkful person. That was done in Canada. That sort of thing would have been just absolutely out of the park crazy talk 5 years ago in this country, right? Well, it's not so crazy anymore. That's something that could absolutely happen. And another thing that could very readily happen is instead of 15% inflation, we could have 40, 50% inflation. We could be Venezuela. We could be Weimar Germany. It could happen within the next month or two. It's not an unrealistic or improbable scenario.
Hear, hear. Eric, we're unfortunately up against the clock. Tell everybody where they can find your website.
Sure. It's etautos.com, the web's best libertarian gearhead site, because I think nobody else has a libertarian gearhead site.
All right. And Eric's got some great food for thought always, whether it's on things automotive or things pertaining to freedom. Eric, I appreciate you dropping by and helping me keep my sanity as we experience yet another week of Clown World.
And likewise, Brian. Look forward to our next chat.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. And a quick thank you to sewingandquiltingcenter.com. They are located in St. George, Utah, so anybody within about a 200-mile radius, maybe further, if you're serious about sewing, this is the one-stop place where you get the very best in sewing machines, embroidery machines, long-arm quilting machines, starting, entry-level machines. You can get an entry-level sewing machine for under $200. Not a bad deal, right? I mean, if you ever tried to sew anything by hand, those machines can save you a lot of time and effort. But if you really get creative, if you're very serious about projects like especially quilting, those long-arm quilting machines are something that have to be seen in order to be believed. And of course, they have all the supplies. They service those machines, including if you bought your machine from somebody else, but you need to get it serviced. Sewingandquiltingcenter.com is there to help you. They're located in St. George, Utah at 779 South Bluff Street. And Teresa and Eric Alsop are two of the finest people you will ever meet in your life. It's a family-owned business. Show them some love and let them take care of you. All right, let's take a moment here to talk about what it meant to be vilified as the unvaccinated. It wasn't that long ago, right? I mean, it was about a little over a year ago, I think, that we really started to see the heat being turned up on the unvaccinated. And it was the last half of 2021 that really got tough. And I'm not trying to play the victim here. I refused the jab. And the main reason I did was because there was such a concerted effort to push and to pressure and to coerce me and to punish me for not doing whatever government was telling me that I just was not going to go along with it. It's like, nope, you're pushing way too hard. This doesn't feel right when somebody is giving me this high pressure. I've seen used car salesmen that'd be like, whoa, dude, back off. you're going to scare them away. But I guess scare was a big part of it. So with all that vilification that went on, and, some of it was from officials, some of it was just from, scared people who were believing that, well, the unvaccinated are the biggest risk among us. I mean, come on. The president himself talked about how last winter was going to be a winter of death and sickness for the unvaxxed. But every so often you encounter someone who realizes they were played and they were wrong. And they fess up to it and they say, you know what, I was wrong. I've changed my thinking. I came across this thread on Twitter, and thanks to the Unroll thread or the Thread Reader app, I have provided this in one nice, easy to read easy one-stop read for you in my show notes. This was posted on Twitter by TED Talk Sof. It says, this is a powerful piece of writing from an Australian writer. The truth is out. What has been done to the people by media, governments, corrupt organizations, and technocrats is unforgivable. We are the many, they are the few, and never again should we allow them to divide us. And then she shares an opinion piece from a vaccinated Australian writer. And this is what that writer said. If COVID was a battlefield, it would still be warm with the bodies of the unvaccinated. Thankfully, the mandates are letting up and both sides of the war stumble back to the new normal. The unvaccinated are the heroes of the last 2 years, as they allowed us all to have a control group in the great experiment and highlight the shortcomings of the COVID vaccines. The unvaccinated carry as many battle scars and injuries as they are the people we tried to mentally break, yet no one wants to talk about what we did to them and what they forced the science to unveil. We knew that the waning immunity of the fully vaccinated had the same risk profile as the others within society as the minority of the unvaccinated. Yet we marked them for special persecution. You see, we said they had not done the right thing for the greater good by handing their bodies and medical autonomy over to the state. Many of the so-called experts and political leaders in Australia admitted the goal was to make life almost unlivable for the unvaccinated, which was multiplied many times by the collective mob with the fight taken into workplaces, friendships, and family gatherings. Today, the hard truth is none of it was justified, as we took a quick slide from righteousness to absolute cruelty. We might lay the blame on our leaders and health experts for the push, but each individual within society must be held accountable for stepping into the well-laid-out trap. We did this despite knowing full well that principled opposition is priceless when it comes to what goes inside our bodies, and we let ourselves be tricked into believing that going into another ineffective lockdown would be the fault of the unvaccinated and not the fault of the toxic policy of the ineffective vaccines. We took pleasure in scapegoating the unvaccinated because after months of engineered lockdowns by political leaders blinded by power, having someone to blame and to burn at the stake felt good. We believed we had logic, love, and truth on our side, so it was easy to wish death upon the unvaccinated. Those of us who ridiculed and mocked the non-compliant did it because we were embarrassed by their courage and principles. I didn't think the unvaccinated would make it through unbroken, and we turned the holdouts into punching bags. And here he names names. Lambie, Carr, Chant, Andrews, McGowan, Gunner, and the other cast of hundreds in prominent roles need to be held to account for vilifying the unvaccinated in public and fueling angry social media mobs. The mobs, the masked Nazis, and the vaccine disciples have been embarrassed by betting against the unvaccinated because mandates only had the power we gave them. It was not compliance that ended domination by big pharma companies, Bill Gates and his many organizations, and the World Economic Forum. It was thanks to the people we tried to embarrass, ridicule, mock, and tear down. We should all try and find some inner gratitude for the unvaccinated as we took the bait by hating them. By hating them because their perseverance and courage bought us time to see we were wrong. So if mandates ever return for COVID or any other disease or virus, hopefully more of us will be awake and see the rising authoritarianism that has no concern for our well-being and is more about power and control. And the writer finishes by saying the war on the unvaccinated was lost, and we should all be very thankful for that. Now, I realize, by sharing this, it sounds pretty self-congratulatory there, Bri. I don't know that I'm not trying to pat myself on the back here because, frankly, this was not something that I don't think anybody who resisted the vaccine was doing it because, hey, this is going to make me stand out. This is going to make me special. As much as I want to make it seem like, oh, yeah, well, of course, it was an easy choice. It was our personal autonomy. It was our informed consent. Anybody would stand up for these things. But it was tough. Mentally, resisting that push for vaccination was one of the toughest things that I've encountered. And I feel like I've spent a good portion of my life, trying to stay rooted in principle. I have a lot of good examples around me, and thank heavens for that. Because I don't know if on my own, I don't know if I'd be strong enough to do it. But thank heavens for the good examples who just simply drew the line and said, look, we're not going to go any further here. But that division that you saw, that was very real. And it happened not just, in the workplace. I mean, look, how many people actually lost jobs because they refused to surrender their personal autonomy? And I get it if some people think, well, that's a stupid reason to lose your job. I mean, all you had to do is just take a little shot. What are you so afraid of? Heard that many, many times. And I think the hardest part, and I'm just going to speak for myself. The hardest part psychologically is seeing something, or at least believing that you see something clearly, and yet it seems like very, very few people are able to see it. And it really does make you stop and wonder, man, maybe I am crazy. Maybe I'm the one who's out of step here. And of course, it didn't help that the fear and the panic and the over caution. Well, we not only need to vaccinate everybody, but we should also make sure everybody's masked up as much as possible. That played into the public's fears as well. And I have a real strong feeling of contempt for much of the media, as well as many of the political and bureaucratic individuals who pushed hard to make that happen. I know people who lost friendships. I know people whose families remain divided to this day over these issues, vaccination, mask mandates, and so forth. So if you're someone who has come to your senses and realized, my gosh, we were being played, look, I don't want to rub your nose in it. I don't want to, I told you so. I want to thank you for having the integrity to recognize, wow, that really was wrong. But I also want to encourage you, when the opportunity arises again, which I'm 99% sure it's going to. After all, those in power saw how well it worked the first time. I hope you will find the courage to stand with those who previously have stood and resist that coercion. The cool thing here is it doesn't take a majority of people. You don't need 50% plus one to know that you're doing the right thing. In fact, even if you're standing there all by yourself and you're doing the right thing and your conscience is at peace, well, that's a reward in itself.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Hey, welcome back to the show. The Heather Turner team at Patriot Home Mortgage has been one of my premier sponsors on this program for quite some time. And I relish when I hear from people who say, hey, we decided we were going to purchase a home, or we decided to refinance our home loan, and they turn to the Heather Turner team. I appreciate those of you who do this and who support my sponsors. Heather and her team at Patriot Home Mortgage have been in the business for decades. So they bring a lot of experience to the table. And I know things are interesting now. There's still a fairly hot real estate market, still a lot of people relocating throughout the West. Even though interest rates are going up, you need someone on your side who has the expertise, the decades of experience, the clout of a company that can make that loan happen and do it in a timely fashion. If you want to reach out to Heather, you can call her at 435-703-4522. Her NMLS ID is 715386. And Patriot Home Mortgage is an equal housing opportunity lender. So have you ever been assaulted with hard questions? I'm not talking about interrogated, by the police or, some enemy soldiers or something that have captured you. But as a parent, you're going to be assaulted with hard questions. I think one of the first times I remember this was when my oldest brought me I guess it was a little biology book, How the Human Body Works. She was maybe 9 years old. She was pretty young, 10 maybe. And she brought me the book and she said, I have a question, Dad. And she unfortunately was on the chapter on reproduction. And I had pictured myself, well, I'll just answer this, as calmly and coolly and, as efficiently as possible because this ain't no thing. It ain't going to faze me. But she then asked a really pointed question about human reproduction. And I was like, deer in the headlights going, yeah, I don't know if I want to answer that. It was all that coolness just kind of faded away. And I was like, yeah, this is one of those times. Go ask your mother. No, I did attempt to answer the question, but it was shocked me at how difficult it was. And, that was just a matter of embarrassment. I chided my parents because they were very, very strict. You don't ask questions about where babies come from. Oh, that's not the kind of question that a kid should be asking. So I think they kind of were from the generation of here's this book, Almost 13, that will give you answers to, human biology. But when you're a parent, you're going to be assaulted with hard questions. Paul Rosenberg has an excellent essay on this. And by the way, the hard questions he's talking about aren't necessarily just, the where do babies come from kind of questions. Actually, these are some of the tougher questions that you might be required to ask or to answer, rather, for a kid who's trying to, sort out right from wrong. And he says that's what's especially hard, is that these are fundamental questions. And the tougher part is most of us lack fundamental, solid answers for them. For instance, if a child were to say to you, well, why shouldn't I lie? It keeps me out of trouble. It helps me get what I want. Most parents wouldn't have a real answer. I mean, you can say, well, lying is a sin or lying is wrong, but that doesn't actually answer the question. It kind of steps around it, referencing an authority saying, don't do this. So again, it's a very fundamental question. Not having a clear answer to it, though, he says, is our problem. It shows us where we're living by dogma and not according to reason and reality. So having a perfect reason for everything is too hard of a job for us, he says, to be sure. And there are times when we have to rely upon something beside pure reason. But for fundamental questions asked by our children, Paul Rosenberg says we really should step up and find good answers. Now, fortunately, finding good answers isn't terribly hard once we stop, take time, and come up with them. But that requires us to say, I'm sorry, I don't have a good enough answer for you right now, but I'll have one for you tomorrow. Now, see, that's honest, and that will actually teach your child to act honestly. So, take, for example, the question about lying. He says the first answer is simple enough. Well, the ability of everyone to get along and trust one another depends upon it. And if that fails, most everything else falls apart with it. And then from there, you can explain the necessity of trust between farmer and seed supplier, car maker and tire maker, and so forth. Then, if you wish, then you can explain the necessity of why trust is why the old moral codes, like the Ten Commandments, make lying an offense, and that it was seen over long periods of time that bearing false witness caused disasters, or that God knew that destroying trust meant disaster. And he says, with that accomplished, you can begin examining the possibility of exceptions to the rule, white lies, to save someone's feelings, and so on. From there, you can move into the problem of getting used to telling those little lies and then becoming false in a great many things. Again, ripping trust apart. Now, he says we could still go deeper on this, how it affects us. That's a crucial issue. But he says, I think you can see how small fundamental questions create hard work for a parent. And he says, for that, you have my condolences, but you got to do the job anyway. But he says, remember, you can always say, that's a hard one to answer. You're going to have to give me a few days for it. There's a little humility in that answer, too, which I think kids need to see. I mean, we want them to believe, yes, I am Superman and I have all the answers to everything, but when they see that you have to learn as well, they'll cut you some slack. Now, Paul Rosenberg talks about a crucial component in answering these questions is to accept that life can be tragic and difficult, and to incorporate that concept into your answers. Now, he says, when I say tragic and difficult, I don't mean that we should be defeatist and moan and complain about things. He says, I honestly think we should feel and act triumphant rather than defeated. But there can be no question that life on this planet is difficult. And we have to accept that fact rather than trying to deny it. He says, I do think we can rise above a lot of the pains and hassles of earth life, but that's the result of heroism. And if we're to be honest, a not insignificant amount of it, of luck as well. Life here, he says, is not fair, and good people do suffer unjustly. So the truth is a primary reason why we must help one another through life. Without helping one another, we wouldn't be able to keep our heads above water, so to speak. We're running just a step or two ahead of tragedy, and if we start placing obstacles in front of one another, well, a whole lot of us will go underwater. Now, even if there was no tragedy on this planet, helping each other forward would still be necessary. It would move us ahead faster and better, but the tragic aspect of life makes it a far more pressing reality and necessity. So he says, here are just a few more of the tough questions along with brief first responses, and these are suggestions only. Dealing with your child in your circumstances is going to require your judgment and creativity. So if a child asks, why do you get to tell me what to do? You can answer, because it's our job to make you a good person. And because children are born knowing almost nothing, parents have to do this. Now, by the time you're big, we won't tell you much of anything. You'll decide everything for yourself. For now, we're trying our best to get you ready for that. How about this one? Why can't I talk about poop? It's funny. Because grown-ups and even older children think it's kind of gross. If you talk about it while they're eating, it makes them feel yucky. And a lot of times it makes them feel yucky even if they're not eating. I know it seems funny to you, but you're making things harder for them. Don't do that. How about, why do I have to use manners? He actually has a great essay specifically for that. Why can't I use bad words? Because it bothers people. People like to use such words because it makes them feel powerful, but it disrupts more important things, necessary things. And a lot of little interruptions can make real problems. So instead of distracting and disrupting people, try to keep things smooth for them. Those words tend to pull people away from better uses of their minds. And how about this one? Why can't I wear this? Now, this is usually an issue of dressing provocatively, and one answer to the question is, again, because it disrupts people. Now, this is complicated, of course, by the fact that young women in particular need to feel like they can disrupt the attention of young men. So this question becomes double difficult in that case. You can explain that this isn't the right time or place to dress that way. Or maybe you need to swallow hard and admit that it is. Or maybe you need to find a middle way. He says, and so we see that parenting is not for the faint of heart. Improvise, adapt, and overcome. I really like his take on helping kids better understand the world without just giving them that pat answer, because I said so. Because I'm the dad and you're not. And there are times where, unfortunately, you're going to have to pull rank and you're going to have to do that. There's once in a while, that's just, unavoidable. But I love that approach of when the kid asks you a tough question, or for that matter, if somebody else asks you a tough question, there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, you know what? I don't have a good answer to that. Give me a day or two. Let me think about it. Some people won't do that because they're afraid they might look stupid. Well, you didn't have the answer right there on the tip of your tongue. Don't be that person. Set the pride aside. Give it some thought. Give them your best answer and be okay if they say, well, I don't know if I can accept that. Growing up, ain't it fun?
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.